Welcome to CCL's Training Tonight, a weekly webinar program of Citizens Climate Lobby that provides CCL supporters with access to in-depth learning opportunities on topics related to climate change and effective climate advocacy. I'm your host, Todd Elbins, CCL's National Actions Director, and tonight's topic is Clean Energy Permitting Reform Updates and Post-Debt Ceiling Deal. Tonight's speaker is Dana Nuccitelli. Dana is an environmental scientist with degrees in astrophysics and physics from UC Berkeley and UC Davis. He is also a climate journalist for skepticalscience.com, The Guardian, and Yale Climate Connections. He is the winner of the NCSE Friends of the Earth Award, and also he is the author of 10 peer-reviewed climate science papers and the author of the book Climatology versus Pseudoscience. If we, and when I say we, I mean Dana, has done a good job, at the end of this webinar, you will learn in this training about, number one, the permitting reform provisions passed in the debt ceiling deal, the key permitting reform provisions that still need to be passed in a comprehensive bipartisan package, and number three, the possibility of a compromised bipartisan permitting reform deal later this year. All right, Dana, let's hand it over to you.
All right, thanks, Todd. Hi, everybody. So yeah, this is going to be an update to the last permitting reform deal CCU we did in May. So we're going to talk about what's happened since then. And we're going to start with the debt ceiling deal, the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023, which had a few permitting items in it. So those kind of go into two categories. One of them is measures to streamline the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which is kind of the main environmental law that governs the permitting process on federal lands. So there were some measures in the permitting reform and the debt ceiling deal to streamline the process to allow regulatory agencies to review environmental documents in the permitting process more efficiently. And so we'll talk about those. And then there was the approval of the Mountain Valley Pipeline. So I just want to touch on that really quickly. So the debt ceiling deal said that the Mountain Valley Pipeline is in the national interest and that it reduces climate pollution, greenhouse gases, which is not so much true, but that's kind of how it was justified for being approved in the debt ceiling deal. This is kind of unfortunate because the Mountain Valley Pipeline permit was going through the judicial review process and really should have just been allowed to complete that process, but instead Congress kind of stepped in and grabbed it and said, no, we're going to take it out and approve it. And they really interfered in the judicial branch's role there, which they really shouldn't be doing. So I think it's useful to characterize that a little differently. Like that's not actually permitting reform. That's more like Congress doing a permitting override of the judicial branch's review process. So I think it's one of these things that it's been kind of classified as permitting reform because it got lumped into permitting reform deals from last year. Joe Manchin's bill had the Mountain Valley Pipeline approval in it, and then it got in the debt ceiling deal. And so people kind of view it as permitting reform, but it's not really actually permitting reform. It just kind of got lumped in there. But really, it's like Congress overriding the permitting process. That being said, while it shouldn't have been done that way, I think it's useful to keep the project in perspective. So as you can see on the chart on the right of the slide here, that's showing the annual additions in U.S. interstate natural gas pipeline capacity every year since 1995. And then the Mountain Valley Pipeline is the red on the very right there. So it's a pretty small addition. It's like less than a 1% increase in our interstate gas pipeline capacity. And it's a small fraction of a percent increase in our annual greenhouse gas emissions from the gas that's going to flow through the pipe. So it's pretty small. And on top of that, there was just an analysis by an energy consulting group that estimated that because the pipeline that the Mountain Valley Pipeline feeds into is already like very heavily used, The Mountain Valley Pipeline only has so much room to add more gas to that pipeline. So they estimated that it will only get about 35% of the Mountain Valley Pipeline's potential utilization. So those numbers that are on here actually be even smaller. Like the red bar is actually smaller than it looks on that bar because on that chart, because it's not going to get full utilization. So it's, in the grand scheme of things, pretty small potatoes, but it's still kind of like a bad precedent that Congress shouldn't have been doing it this way. The silver lining is that the Mountain Valley Pipeline has kind of been a bit of a poison pill in the permitting reform process. We've been trying to cobble together these bipartisan deals. You know, a lot of people didn't want to include the Mountain Valley Pipeline approval for these reasons, but now it's been taken care of. It's been approved, and so in a new permitting reform package going forward, we don't have to worry about the Mountain Valley Pipeline being included as a poison pill anymore. So it will make the next permitting reform deal probably a little bit easier, that we don't have to worry about that. So that's kind of nice. So let's talk about the more permitting reform relevant stuff in the debt ceiling deal. And those were all related to streamlining NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. So one thing that the bill did is that oftentimes when you have a big energy project that's going through the permitting process, there are often multiple different federal agencies working on that permitting process. And so, you know, that can become kind of clumsy. And so a good way to get that organized better is to designate a lead agency that is kind of assigned the role of making the final decisions. And then the other participating agencies kind of provide inputs to that lead agency, but it kind of creates one decision maker, so that, you know, streamlines the process a little bit. So that was good. Also, oftentimes the individual agencies will be working on their own environmental documents, and so then you get a lot of duplicative work because they're each doing their own thing. And so the debt ceiling deal said we should have the agencies all work together on one environmental review document, which is also easier when you have a lead agency in charge. So those things will both streamline the process. Those are both good. It set document time and page limits. So now environmental assessments, which are kind of like moderately sized environmental reviews of the permitting process, those are now limited to 1 year and 75 pages for the documents. And environmental impact statements, which are very big environmental reviews for big projects that could potentially have a serious environmental impact. The debt ceiling deal limited those to 2 years and 150 pages, unless they're particularly complex, in which case they can have 300 pages. The page limits are not particularly useful, but the time limits will kind of give the agencies a nice timeline to adhere to. And there is an important addition to that, that the regulatory agencies can potentially ask for extensions. If they can't meet those 1 year or 2 year deadlines, they can ask the project applicant. They can have a little bit more time to finish these assessments, which the project applicant would then be smart to allow them to have those extensions, because if you're rushing the federal agencies into an incomplete, publishing an incomplete assessment, that opens up the door for potential lawsuits for organizations saying, hey, you rushed the agencies, the document is faulty, and so now we're going to sue. And nobody wants lawsuits. They take a very long time. They really extend project timelines quite a lot when we're waiting for these lawsuits to go through the courts. And so it's kind of in everybody's best interest to allow these extensions to happen when they're needed. So I'm glad that that was included in the debt ceiling deal. A little bit of a controversial aspect that was included in the debt ceiling deal is allowing project applicants, or more likely third-party contractors that they hire, to draft their environmental documents. Some people are concerned that that's kind of like putting the fox in charge of the hen house, because the applicant, of course, wants the project to go through. It's in their best interest. And so hypothetically, they could try to, you know, bias the documents, maybe hide some data, cut some corners, do something to make it more likely that the project will go through. However, the debt ceiling deal also said that the regulatory agencies have to review those documents, and they have to take responsibility for the accuracy of those documents. So I personally don't have much of the way of concerns about this aspect, because this is actually something that I did in my prior career before CCL. I was an environmental consultant working on some environmental projects, and we would draft documents, and it was in our companies and our clients' best interest to kind of get the thing done with the most profit margin, largest profit margin possible. But we were submitting these documents to regulatory agencies who did a very good job. They had a lot of experience and made sure that the documents and the cleanups and everything were being done very thoroughly and as they should be. And in this case, since the regulatory agencies have been writing these environmental documents through the NEPA process, like they have the experience knowing like where the databases are to find the information and what the documents should look like. And so I think in all likelihood, they will be pretty good at making sure that corners aren't cut and the data isn't missing and the documents are accurate. And the benefit is that we're probably going to see a lot of these environmental documents have to be produced because we're trying to build a whole lot of clean energy projects. And so allowing third-party applicants and contractors to write these documents will kind of take the burden off of the regulatory agencies themselves, because it's a lot easier to review a document than it is to do all the research and write the document. And so that will ease their burden and allow the process to happen a lot faster. So I think that was a pretty good inclusion. Another really good thing that the debt ceiling agreement did was start the process of creating an online permitting portal where project applicants and the public will be able to see where in the permitting process a given project is. So that creates more transparency. So that's a really good thing that a lot of people wanted to see. So in the last CCU I did, we talked about this Chamber of Commerce coalition letter on permitting reform that CCL signed on to, that listed these 4 kind of categories of things that we wanted to see happen in the permitting process. One of them being increased predictability for the length of time that these permitting projects will take. And so that is something that we got in the debt ceiling deal because we got this 1-year and 2-year deadlines. So we have a better idea of how long the permitting process will take now. So that gets a nice green check mark. We wanted to see more efficiency and better interagency coordination when we have multiple agencies working on permitting of a certain project. And we did get that through the lead agency designation and having the agencies work on a single environmental document. So that gets a check mark too. So that's good. Wanted to see more transparency in the permitting process, and we're going to get that with this online permitting portal. So that gets a check mark. And then the last item we wanted to get stakeholder input improved so that all the relevant stakeholders can make sure their voices are heard in the permitting process. That's something we didn't get anything on in the permitting reforms in the debt ceiling deal. So that's still missing, but we got 3 of the 4 items on this checklist checked. So that's pretty good. And then if we also go back to the types of policies that CCL wanted to see in the permitting reform process, we wanted to get something that will add to America's capacity to transmit clean electricity, because electricity transmission is a key bottleneck, as I'll talk about here in a few minutes. Unfortunately, there really wasn't anything on transmission in the debt ceiling deal. We wanted to get some stuff to speed up the approval of clean energy projects. So we did get some of that in these streamlining of the NEPA process. So that's at least we got some of that. So that gets a check mark. And we wanted to get, again, preserve and improve a community's ability to make their voices heard on the projects that could potentially impact their communities. And we didn't get anything on that. So those are kind of really the 2 big categories: the adding to our capacity to transmit clean electricity and improving early community involvement. Those are the big things we wanted to get that were not included in the debt ceiling deal. So going back to that transmission component, electrical transmission, again, that is really, really important because that's a key bottleneck, because we got those clean energy tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, which combined with just the fact that the costs of wind and solar energy have come down super fast. They're really clean, they're really cheap, everybody wants them. Supply chain bottlenecks are starting to open up. And so we're expecting to see this explosion in wind and especially solar energy in the United States over the next few years. But those big wind and solar farms tend to be located in rural areas where there is affordable available land, which is pretty far away from where most people live in big population centers. And so you need the transmission lines to connect the 2. And so transmission lines are really critical for getting those solar and wind farms connected to the grid. but right now it's taking on average a decade to build a new transmission line in the United States. And so that is the key bottleneck right now that's holding up this rapid transition to a clean energy economy. So that's why transmission is so important to get in permitting reform. And again, as the Princeton repeats energy modelers found, if we don't start building transmission lines, especially faster, we will potentially only achieve about 20% of the possible pollution reduction from the Inflation Reduction Act, because we won't be able to connect those wind and solar farms to the grid. So that's really something that we want to get in the next round of permitting reform. And the other big item is the early community involvement that I talked about. That is to ensure that frontline communities are able to make their voices heard in the permitting process of projects that could directly impact them. And it also has the benefit of reducing the risk of later lawsuits brought by groups whose input was excluded from the process. And so if you can actually get all the stakeholders who will potentially be impacted by a project involved early in the process, so their voices are heard and they have input in what happens, then they're less likely to bring a lawsuit once the permitting process is finalized. And again, those lawsuits are really what can really extend the timelines of these projects for years and years. And so everybody wants to avoid those lawsuits. And so early community involvement is a really important thing to include as well. So that's something we're trying to get in the next round of permitting reform. So I'm going to go back to the key individual permitting reform components that I talked about in the last CCU and see where we're at on those post debt ceiling deal and post conference. So one key thing, we're trying to get, as I said, trying to get those transmission lines built faster. So one way to do that is to give the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, authority over interstate transmission lines, these big lines that go across multiple states, because otherwise you have to get permits from each individual state. But for example, for interstate gas pipelines, FERC handles the permitting process themselves and they get input from each individual state, but they are doing the whole permitting process. And so that is much more efficient and it goes much more quickly. So we would like transmission lines to get some kind of similar treatment as these interstate gas pipelines get. And we would also like to see FERC get a cost allocation authority, which will alleviate the problem that when there's a big transmission line or similar big project, oftentimes different parties will fight over who's going to pay for how much of the project. And those fights can take a long time. So if instead you give FERC the authority to allocate the cost proportional to who benefits from how much of the project. So for example, if you're on the end of the transmission line receiving all that clean electricity, you're getting a large chunk of the benefits. And so you would pay for a large chunk of the costs. And so that process would then alleviate these long extended fights that you can sometimes have over who's going to pay for how much of the project. So those are things that progressives, the blue check mark, and centrists, the purple check mark, have proposed in different permitting reform proposals. That is not something that was touched on in the debt ceiling deal. So that is still on the table for a potential next round of permitting reform negotiations. Then there are the measures to make regulatory agencies more efficient and more transparent in the permitting process and their environmental documents preparation. That's something that everybody across the political spectrum wants to see. We like helping the regulatory agencies work more efficiently. We got a little bit of that in the debt ceiling deal. As I said, we got the measure to designate a lead agency in working on these big projects. One thing we didn't get is a dispute resolution procedure, which idea there is sometimes the agencies will disagree on a certain point of a permitting or environmental review documents. And so right now there's not like an established way for them to resolve those disputes. And so this would just have some established procedure, something simple like telling the agencies within 30 days, you have to get together in a meeting and resolve this dispute. And then within the next 30 days, issue that resolution, just something simple like that. But that wasn't yet included in the debt ceiling deal. We did get those environmental review timelines, the 1 year on environmental assessments and the 2-year limit on environmental impact statements. And we did get the online permitting portal started, so that will improve transparency. So we got that, that's good. Then centrists and conservatives have proposed expanding this program called Fast 41, which is basically an interagency permitting council where we have a bunch of different agencies that work on permitting, and they designate a pretty high level person to be on this Fast 41 council. And then those people give important projects a more rapid review. And they have their own online portal for transparency, and it's a good program. And so there's been proposals to expand that to more projects. We did get a little bit of an expansion in the debt ceiling deal because now energy storage projects qualify or can qualify for Fast 41, which they previously couldn't. So there's a little bit of an expansion just to include that one more category of energy projects. But we could expand it further. For example, right now, a project has to have $200 million in investments to potentially qualify for Fast 41. And Senator Manchin proposed in his bill to lower that threshold to $50 million so that more projects could potentially qualify. So that's another thing that would be a larger expansion of Fast 41 that could still happen in another permitting reform bill. Then there's some measures to expedite the approvals of clean energy projects. For example, having federal agencies look at a map of the country and environmentally sensitive areas and designate areas that are low environmental sensitivity. That would be a good place to build these energy projects, and saying, if you build in this area, we've said it's already a low impact area, so we're going to do a quick expedited environmental review and permitting process. So that would be something that would make these projects go quicker. And another thing that we could do is consider all of the co-benefits of a project. So for example, if you're going to build a transmission line and you know that is going to allow more solar and wind farms to get connected to the grid, that's going to mean less air pollution, less climate pollution. The transmission line is going to make the grid more robust and protect against power outages and things like that. And so there are all these other benefits that the project could bring that you could consider, and then make it more likely that that project will eventually be approved. So those are things that have been proposed by progressives and centrists, but none of those were included in the debt ceiling deal. And so that's something that's still on the table that could be included in a future permitting reform bill. And as I discussed, there was nothing in there included on early community involvement, which is something that progressives and centrists have proposed would be a good idea to beef up as previously discussed. So let's look at kind of the key things that each side of the political spectrum wants to see. The priorities for progressives are to speed up the transmission line permitting, as I mentioned, to get better early community involvements, and also to get more engagement of environmental justice groups and communities in the permitting process. The main things that conservatives want to see are the streamlining of the NEPA environmental review and permitting process, and also a shortening of the statute of limitations of lawsuits and the NEPA process. Because right now, after a project is permitted and approved, there's a 6-year window during which a lawsuit can be brought, and that creates a lot of uncertainty for project developers. If they can start building a big energy project and then 6 years later it could be ground to a halt by a lawsuit, project developers don't like that. And so conservatives have proposed to shorten that timeline. And so of all these things, really the only thing that was included in the debt ceiling deal was that streamlining of the NEPA process. So some folks have expressed some concern that conservatives got one of the main categories of things that they wanted to get in the permitting process, and progressives didn't get anything. And so now there's kind of less left on the table to bring conservatives on board for a second round of a permitting reform deal. So now we kind of have to find things that they still want that haven't been passed yet. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. But the inclusion of those NEPA streamlining measures, they're good things, but they create a challenge that it's going to be a little harder to come to a second bipartisan agreement. So let's look at what's left on each side, specifically starting with progressives, and then we'll go to the conservatives. So progressives want the early community involvement in the permitting process. They also want to improve interregional transmission capacity, which is the amount of electricity that can be transferred between different regions. different grid operators. That would have a number of benefits, like it would make the grid more robust and avoid so many blackouts, for one thing, because you can exchange more electricity. So if there's one region that's getting hit hard by an intense weather pattern, like a big heat wave or a polar vortex or something, they can like bring in more electricity from other regions that aren't experiencing that extreme weather. So that would be nice. And it would also allow, because you're having more transmission capacity, it would allow more wind and solar and other clean energy to be added to the grid. So that's something that Senator John Hickenlooper tried to introduce with his bill called the Big Wires Act, which is just a great name for a bill. It's an acronym for something, but it's called the Big Wires Act. He tried to get that into the debt ceiling deal, but Republicans felt like they couldn't get on board with that. So instead, they included a provision to have the Department of Energy do a study to see how much interregional transmission capacity is a good amount. So this is going to be like a 2 to 3 year study, instead of just telling the regions like do more capacity of this transmission between your regions. There's going to be this study of how much there should be, which is not really a necessary thing, but that's what was in the debt ceiling deal. So a nice thing is that the debt ceiling deal didn't say we have to wait for those results, and so we could still in the next round do something on interregional capacity. And as I mentioned, it would be nice to have FERC have some more authority over these interstate transmission lines, over the permitting, so that they can kind of streamline that process and just bring in the input from the states, but do the permitting themselves. So that's something that's still on board that progressives want to see. I discussed the cost allocation authority for FERC. Some have proposed that FERC should have an office of transmission, because transmission is so important. And it's so complicated getting all the transmission across the entire country that maybe we should create a specific office of transmission within FERC. Progressives also like to see environmental justice liaisons within FERC. And as I mentioned, they would like to see these go-to areas of low environmental sensitivity designated by federal agencies to allow for faster permitting in those areas, and the consideration of all the co-benefits of the projects to make it more likely that things like big important transmission lines will get approved. So that's kind of the main list of stuff that's left for progressives to get. These first 4 are particularly important, but then the other ones will be bonuses for them. So then let's talk about what conservatives still want, which is kind of the key question right now, because there's lots of stuff that progressives want that they didn't get. But as I said, conservatives got some of the stuff they want, so let's see what's left. So I did mention the NEPA statute of limitations for lawsuits. It's currently 6 years, and conservatives would really like to shorten that, because that is a long time, creates a lot of project uncertainty, and there have been a lot of different proposals for how much to shorten that statute of limitations. So for example, Shelley Moore Capito, a senator from West Virginia, she created this Restart Act that in it, she proposed a 2-month statute of limitations for these lawsuits. House Republicans in their HR 1, the very first bill they introduced in this session of Congress, which was all about energy and permitting reform, they proposed a 4-month statute of limitations on these NEPA lawsuits. Senator Manchin in his bill last year, reintroduced in this session of Congress, proposed a 5-month statute of limitations. There was a centrist think tank called ITIF. In their proposal, they suggested a 2-year statute of limitations. And there was one progressive Democrat proposal from Senators Carper and Schatz, their PEER Act. They suggested that we should basically cut the statute of limitations in half, down to 3 years. So you can see there's a very wide range here from 2 months to 3 years. So basically they're going to have to go into negotiations and figure out what the sweet spot is that everybody can agree to. It's also important to get the sweet spot right, because you don't want the statute of limitations to be too short, because if there's an organization that's considering bringing a lawsuit and they're running up against that statute of limitations because it's too short, that kind of forces their hand and forces them to bring a lawsuit. And that's actually counterproductive, because you would prefer that they didn't bring a lawsuit, because that will extend the project timeline. So ideally, you want to give these organizations enough time to consider, all the data and look at the permit and see if they agree and if it's worth their time to bring a lawsuit. but not have it take too long that you're creating too much uncertainty for these project developers. So where that sweet spot is, I don't know, but it's going to be somewhere in the middle of this range of proposals. So another item that conservatives have been talking about is Clean Water Act Section 401. So this is a section of the Clean Water Act that allows states to certify whether federal projects meet their local water quality rules and protect their local bodies of water. And so this is something that states that are not too thrilled with fossil fuel projects will sometimes use to reject fossil fuel project permits. So for example, the state of New York has used this to reject a couple of gas pipelines, and the state of Washington used it to reject a coal terminal. But when they're doing this, sometimes they will consider things other than direct water impacts like air pollution or climate pollution. And so conservatives, Republicans tend not to like that because their argument is this is the Clean Water Act. You should be considering water impacts and not air and climate impacts, which I think is not an unreasonable thing to argue. And so they want to limit its scope of this Section 401 of the Clean Water Act to only include and consider local water quality impacts. Democrats will tend to argue like they want every tool in the toolbox to try and stop fossil fuel infrastructure that they think is problematic. And so they want to keep this provision and this larger scope in Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. So one new happening in this area is this recent Supreme Court decision, Sackett v. EPA, which really limited the number and the types of bodies of water that are covered under the Clean Water Act, which I've talked about. I am not a fan, to say the least, of that Supreme Court decision. I think it's similar to Congress kind of overriding the judicial branch to approve the Mountain Valley Pipeline. This is like the judicial branch overriding Congress to rewrite the Clean Water Act so that it covers less types of bodies of water, which they shouldn't be doing. But regardless of what you think of this decision, it happened. It's a thing. So now there are going to be fewer bodies of water, like wetlands, for example, that are covered by the Clean Water Act, including being covered under Section 401. And so now this tool is less of a potent one for states. And so maybe it's just something that's a little easier for progressives who didn't want to make this concession to conservatives. Maybe it's a little bit easier now that it's kind of been gutted a little bit. And now states are going to have to look at ways to do their own state laws to protect things like wetlands that are no longer covered by the Clean Water Act. So that might be a different way to address this. It's all this from what we've heard in DC. This is also something that conservatives really need to have in a bipartisan permitting reform deal. Like this is one of their top demands. So it's something that they're probably going to have to get if we're going to get a bipartisan second round of a permitting reform deal. So we'll see if that concession is able to be made. So a few of the things that conservatives are particularly interested in. One is allowing the reuse if there has been environmental assessment of a project, and then it goes into the NEPA process to allowing the reuse of that assessment if the project and the property haven't significantly changed, which I think makes sense. I mentioned there wasn't an agency dispute resolution procedure established in the debt ceiling deal, so conservatives would still like to see that as another measure that could streamline NEPA a little bit further. An interesting one is that conservatives have been looking and proposing things that will benefit geothermal projects. So this is in part because oil and gas companies are very interested in geothermal projects because it's really in their expertise to do drilling and subsurface rock and fracking and things like that, or fracturing rock, that are very relevant to geothermal energy. So it's kind of an off-ramp for them to get away from dirty energy into the clean energy industry using their expertise. And so there have been a lot of big oil and gas companies that have established kind of geothermal power divisions, and they're very interested in this. But because they've had such power and influence in their lobbying, oil and gas companies have gotten exemptions for small-scale exploratory oil and gas drilling that haven't been applied to geothermal drilling. even though geothermal drilling, if anything, is probably lower environmental impact than oil and gas drilling. And so conservatives have proposed applying those same exemptions that oil and gas drilling gets to geothermal drilling, which I think makes a lot of sense. And they have also proposed to do regular federal land lease sales for geothermal projects, which I think would be really good because geothermal, it's like a potentially big, clean, if it can make it cost effective, it's a firm source of power. Like it would be a really great thing if we could get a bunch of geothermal power going. And so it would be nice to see some permitting reforms there so that it doesn't take so long, because right now it takes a very long time to get geothermal projects permitted. Okay. Next one. There we go. So that's pretty much the rub of the specifics of what everybody wants. Negotiations are ongoing right now. From what we've heard, both parties do see the potential for a comprehensive second permitting reform deal. What we got in the debt ceiling was a nice start. It's just kind of modest and small. Like it'll streamline NEPA a little bit, but we still need to do a lot more on things like transmission and early community involvements and some other items that we discussed here. So we expect the negotiations between the two parties to continue probably throughout the summer. They're always looking for different must-pass bills to kind of attach things to, like there's an appropriations bill coming up, and who knows when it'll actually happen, but the negotiations are happening, and at some point we expect, hopefully they'll come to some kind of bipartisan agreements and propose it, and then we'll have a look at it and see what we think about it. But hopefully it will include a lot of these provisions that we discussed today.
So thank you for joining. If you would like to follow along with CCL and all things science and nerd, you can join the Nerd Corner and post questions in the forum of the Nerd Corner. Here's Dana's email address if you'd like to follow up. We did have one question from Alex that we didn't get answered, so you can post that in the Nerd Corner if you'd like, Alex, or send it to Dana. So thank you all for joining, and we will see you at the CCU next week.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.